All right, we're going to continue with graphing sine and cosine, but today our period is going to change. And so what the period is how long it takes your graph to repeat its pattern. So with sine, you know, the pattern is it starts at 0, goes to 1, goes back to 0, goes to -1, back to 0. It does that normally in 2 pi units. Now we're going to change that. And what affects that is the number that's in front of the x. So we will take our normal period, which is 2 pi, and divide by that number that's in front of the x. And that will either increase your period, shorten your period, or make your period longer, meaning it takes a longer time before that pattern repeats. So my first two examples, let me zoom in a little bit. My first two examples, I have a 2 in front of my x. So that's going to cause my period to go from 2 pi, and then I have to divide that by 2. So my period is going to be pi. So instead of everything repeating after 2 pi units, it's going to repeat after pi units. So I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to end at pi. And then these increments, we always take our period and divide it by 4, and that's what I'm going to be going by as I move across this period. So pi over 4 is my interval. So I'll start at 0, I'll go to pi over 4, then I'll add pi over 4 to pi over 4, which is pi over 2, and then I'll go pi over 2 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4, and then of course 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 4 pi over 4 pi. And then I'm going to use my normal sine values, which are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. So I'm just going to divide these into smaller units. And you're going to want to graph at least one full period. Probably at least 2 periods. So I'm going to start at 0, 0, pi over 4, 1, pi over 2, 0, 3 pi over 4, -1, and then pi 0, then my pattern repeats. And then coming this way, I'm going to be going down. All right, my next one will be very similar, except for now I'm going to be graphing cosine. Again, I'm going to take my normal period of 2 pi divided by the number that's in front of the x. 2 pi divided by 2 is pi. So I'm going to start at 0, end at pi. These intervals will be pi over 4. So pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4. So I'm going to have to again make these smaller intervals. And then my pattern for cosine is 1, 0, -1, 0, 1. So we start up, 0, down, 0, up, 0, down, 0, up, 0. Come this way, down, up, 0. So there's several periods of my cosine graph. Now we're going to talk about phase shifts. And how you know that you have a phase shift is that you'll see parentheses. And remember, whenever we have parentheses grouped with the x, that's a right or a left phase shift, and it's always the opposite. So this is going to be a phase shift of right pi over 2. So all my x's, these are my regular x's, now I'm moving them right pi over 2. So that means I'm going to be adding pi over 2 to these x values. If you struggle with fractions, this could be a little bit of a challenge, but you'll have to get common denominators sometimes. Other times you just be adding to it and it won't have to get a common denominator. So 0 plus pi over 2, of course, is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. Pi plus pi over 2, so if I'm doing pi plus pi over 2, I need a common denominator. So this is over 1, so this becomes 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which is 3 pi over 2. So this is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. And then 2 pi plus pi over 2 will be 5 pi over 2. And then my normal sine numbers, so 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. So all this did was take my normal x values and shift them right pi over 2. So here I have a shift that will be opposite of this, so this will be left pi over 4. Left pi over 4. So again, I don't have a change in my period because there's still a 1 in front of that x, same thing over here. So my x values, my normal x values are going to be my 0 pi over 2 pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Now I'm moving left pi over 4. That means I'm subtracting pi over 4 from my normal x. So 0 minus pi over 4 is negative pi over 4. Pi over 2 minus pi over 4. Pi over 2 minus pi over 4. You're going to get a common denominator, so that's going to be 2 pi over 4. So 2 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is just pi over 4. Pi minus pi over 4, or if you want to think about 1 minus a fourth, is 3 fourths, so 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 4. So this is going to be 6 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. And then 2 pi minus pi over 4. So this becomes 8 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is 7 pi over 4. And then I'll have my normal cosine values, which are 1, 0, negative 1, 0, and 1. All right, on this one, I'm going to do everything, so I have to check my period. My period is going to stay 2 pi, so I'm going to start at 0 to 2 pi. My increments are pi over 2. But now this is a shift left pi over 4. So we already did that over here, so I'm just going to copy those values over here. Negative pi over 4, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. And then I would do my normal sine values, which are 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0. And next, I'd take care of my amplitude. My amplitude is 3, so that all of these x values get multiplied by 3. So 0, 3, 0, negative 3, 0. And then finally, my shift downward of 2. So we will subtract 2 from all of these values. So negative 2, 1, negative 2, negative 5, negative 2. So when you shift down,